Hey, my name is Will Tong. I'm the CEO and founder of PRE-LEASE. I'm a commercial property expert. I've been in the industry for over 22 years, and I know a thing or two about commercial developments. So this is a video explaining my pre-lease campaign framework that's going to really help you if you're considering developing commercial properties. So this is really relevant to commercial property developers and investors, not so much to owner occupiers. So let's say you're a commercial property, you have a commercial property that you wish to develop, but you're not quite sure where to start or you don't think you have the funds for it. This is really going to help you. So I'm going to walk you through how to run a successful pre-lease campaign so that you can potentially get the bank to fund 100% of your build costs, you don't out of pocket. Number two, you'll be able to minimize a lot of your development risk and walk away with massive profits. And number three, once you learn these steps, this framework, you'll be able to rinse and repeat this process. Okay, so here are some common mistakes and misconceptions. So the number one misconception is you have to have a lot of capital. You have to have a lot of money in the bank to be able to be a commercial property developer. Okay, having money obviously helps, but that's one misconception. Number two is you have to get the development application approved before you can do anything. Well, that's also a misconception. Number three is you have to complete the building first before actually going out and finding a tenant. That is a massive misconception. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to flip the script around. So why am I saying these are misconceptions? Well, imagine this. Imagine you went ahead and you built the building first and then go and find a tenant. What would happen? One, you have to use a lot of your capital because the banks are less likely to lend a lot of money because you don't have a incoming tenant. Number two, you build a building which may not be 100% suitable for an incoming tenant. So you probably have to spend more money in modifying the building. So it's going to cost you more money, it's going to cost you more time, and there's more risks involved. So in order for us to make this a successful development, we're going to use a pre-lease campaign. So what is a pre-lease? A pre-lease is also known as a pre-commitment. So think about it as a apartment pre-sale campaign or buying apartments off the plan. So typically developers, they need to sell a certain percentage of their apartments off the plan before they even turn soil, before they even commence construction, before the bank would actually fund them the money to develop. So this is very, very common. So similarly, what we're asking for is we're asking for a tenant to pre-commit to a certain development before you actually start building. Okay, so there's a lot of advantages here, as I mentioned before. Number one is you can potentially get the bank to fund you 100% of the construction, and I'll walk you through that process in a minute. And number two, it doesn't cost you, actually cost you next to nothing to run a pre-lease campaign. And you can capture a tenant, and you can then design a building that's customized for them. So that's going to cost you a little bit less and going to save you a lot more time. Okay, so once we kind of understand the advantage of running a pre-lease campaign, now that we do know, I'm going to run you through the pre-lease framework. Okay, so the pre-lease framework has 11 steps, and step one is doing your market research. So why is this important? Because if you have a commercial property, it might have various different use cases. Again, not like residential where it's just for someone to live in. Commercial properties potentially have a number of different use cases. So what you want to do is you want to find out, what are some of the possible use cases and determine what are the highest and best use for your potential property. So you want to speak to property professionals, property agents, maybe architects, town planners, get as much data and information as you can during this process. The other thing you also want to know is what are the expected rents and cap rates for your property based on the highest and best use. You also want to know what are the estimated build costs for the said use cases. And finally, you want to put all that into a feasibility study to make sure that the development actually makes sense financially. So once you've completed your market research, you move on to step 2, which is producing some preliminary designs. So engage an architect to come up with a few preliminary design drawings and renders based on some of the use cases. So you might want to give the architect maybe 2 or perhaps 3 of the use cases and get them to come up with some preliminary drawings and renders. And this is really useful because we're going to start using this as part of our marketing material for step 3, which is appointing leasing agents to start looking and sourcing prospective tenants for us. So using the preliminary designs, the agents can now start seeking pre-lease interests. Okay, so this process could take several weeks or several months, depending on how complicated the particular use cases are. And once you've appointed a well-experienced leasing agent with contacts and track record, they'll be able to advise you on who are some of these tenants that will potentially lease your property. So let's say you've started the pre-lease campaign. You have now a number of prospective tenants who are potentially interested in your development. You move on to step 4, which is you invite these prospective tenants to submit an expression of interest or an EOI, or to give us an offer to lease. So this is basically starting the discussion and starting the negotiation process for the pre-lease. So, which is step number 5. So after you've gone through a few rounds of negotiations with a tenant or several tenants, then you would then ask the prospective tenant that you've chosen to sign off on a heads of agreement. So the heads of agreement is basically a summary of all the essential terms that you have already agreed to. Now, bear in mind, a heads of agreement or HOA is not a legally binding document. However, it is a very useful document for discussions and to instruct the solicitors, which I'll cover off in a second. So as I mentioned, just note that the negotiations process can take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months, depending on the nature of the tenant. So if the tenant is a major corporation and have several layers of decision making, then the negotiations can take a lot longer than a tenant that has a much simpler and quicker decision-making process. So don't be surprised if negotiations takes several months. So assuming the heads of agreement has been executed by both parties, containing all the essential terms of the pre-lease, then you will then send your heads of agreement to your lawyer, who will then start preparing and reviewing the agreement for lease, so the AFL. So what's an agreement for lease? The agreement for lease is a binding document which acts in lieu of an actual lease document. Because your building is not completed yet, you cannot officially enter into a lease. So the agreement for lease acts in lieu of a lease agreement during this construction period. Okay, so at this stage, when your lawyer is preparing and negotiating the agreement for lease, the architect may need to revise the preliminary designs so that we can include them into the AFL, okay, included into the agreement for lease. So step 7, which is the next step, is signing the AFL. So as I mentioned, the AFL is a legally binding document. So once it's executed by both parties, the pre-lease is completed. So both parties are locked in. And from here onwards, both parties will now proceed with fulfilling the conditions in the AFL to prepare for the construction of the property. So once that's all locked in, step 8 is to submit your development application. Okay, so submitting your DA. So your architect shall now be completing a full set of design drawings that are required to submit a development application. So once the architect's done all that and you've submitted the DA, you're basically now waiting for the DA to be approved. So while the DA is with the government waiting for its approval, there's a number of things that you can do while you're waiting. Okay, so that includes step 9, which is obtaining building quotes. So using the relevant documents and plans, present these to several builders and obtain a few building quotes. Okay, so you may end up negotiating with a few builders, and then you would then proceed with the build contract. Now, the build contract, you have to make it subject to finance and subject to development approval. So once you've got the build contract sorted or about to be sorted, you will then go to step 10, which is obtaining finance, obtaining construction finance, which is a very, very important part. So show the signed AFL and other relevant documents, including the build contract, to several prospective lenders. You may want to shop around here because what we're looking for is a very, very specific requirement. So I recommend that you apply for a construction loan with an appropriate lender that's going to lend you money based on the maximum LVR off of the gross realization. Okay, so what is a gross realization? What is the gross realization? The gross realization is simply what the property is worth after it's completed. So what is the valuation of the property after it's completed? So why is this important? So if you apply for a construction loan the traditional way, the bank will just lend you a percentage of the construction amount. They very rarely give you 100% of it. So let's just say, for example, it costs you $5 million to build the property. It's a $5 million construction. If you go the traditional route, the bank might lend you 70, 80% of the $5 million. So you would then have to come up with your own money. Whatever the difference is, $1 million, $1.5 million of your own money. However, if you do it this way, where you're basing it off the gross realization, you can borrow enough money to cover the entire construction cost. So, for example, let's say upon completion, the gross realization of property value is $8 million, let's just say, and you're borrowing 70% against $8 million. So 70% of $8 million is $5.6 million. So that you're going to have enough money to cover your construction costs. Okay, so it's very important that you get this structure right, and you may have to shop around to a number of different lenders that's going to agree with that. So this is how you could potentially fund 100% of the construction through the bank's money. And then finally, step 11. So once you've got the finance sorted out, the build contract sorted out, and your DA has been approved, then you can then start the development process. Now, this is where the builder is going to come in and take over the process. Obviously, there's still a few more things that you need to do before they should turn soil, but essentially this is where the builder will take things out of your hand and start the construction process. Okay, so let me just recap the 11 steps of the pre-lease framework. So step 1 is doing your market research, coming up with the best use case and the returns, and completing a feasibility study. Number 2 is coming up with your preliminary design drawings and renders so they can use that for marketing, which leads to step 3. It's appointing leasing agents to start attracting prospective tenants. And then moving on to step 4 is asking these prospective tenants to provide an expression of interest, which then moves on to step 5, which is beginning the negotiation process. And assuming that the negotiation goes well, you would then sign off on the heads of agreement, the HOA, which then moves to step 6, which is the preparation of the agreement for lease. At this stage, your architect may need to revise the preliminary drawings to be included in the AFL. And then step 7 is signing the AFL. So the AFL is a legally binding document Once both parties has executed, then both parties need to proceed with fulfilling the conditions in the AFL. Step 8 is then preparing for your development application. So your architects will help you with that. So once you've submitted your documents to the government for approval, then simultaneously you will then go to step 9, which is obtaining a number of building quotes using the DA and various other documents. And then once you've got the builders sorted, you move on to step 10, which is obtaining construction finance. And then finally, step 11, once the DA is approved and your finance is approved, then you can start the construction process. Okay, so hopefully this video has been really helpful. Hopefully the pre-lease framework is something that you understand and that you can start using and applying to your own property deals. And most importantly, if you enjoyed this video and you find it was helpful and it was good value, then please like it. Please share it with your friends, your colleagues. And also, depending on which platform you're on, please also subscribe or follow to my channel as well. All right, I look forward to seeing you in the next video.